In this video, I'd like to talk about how sawdust has worked for us, both as a way to keep pathways clean and weed-free during the growing season, and as a way to harvest it in the fall to build up beds and increase overall fertility. So stick around. I made a video back in August of 2017. I'm going to link to that here, where I first talked about how we're using sawdust in the pathways, and I was actually putting out the question, have other folks used sawdust and what do they think of it? I'm not suggesting that sawdust is the best mulch by any stretch, but maybe where you live, it's harder for you to get wood chips or harder for you to get hay or straw, and sawdust may be free or readily available. And so I want to speak to how well it's worked for us. Since 2017, we've been using it extensively. And in fact, this season, back in July of 2019, I invested in 37 yards of sawdust from a local firewood processor. They delivered it here. It was $400, but it ended up being $11 a yard for this sawdust, and we're using it extensively in the chicken yard, and in the case of this video, we're using it as a deep mulch in our walkways through the growing season. And you can see here, this is the sawdust after a season of growing. We put it on about 6 inches, almost 8 inches thick. And this morning it got a little cold, so it's frosty and a little frozen here. We're in late fall. But you can see that if I get underneath this frostiness of the sawdust, there's reason number one that I think it's a great material. It's a good insulator. And so yes, it frosted up a little, but the soil underneath, in fact, if I dig in a little, completely thawed under there. And so what we've been learning is that you can apply sawdust very deeply in your walkways. What I would not do is consider sawdust fresh, raw, dry sawdust as a great deep mulch in a garden bed. It takes a while for it to absorb moisture, for fungal life to get into it and wake it up. And so its best application seems to be early in the season, deep application in the walkways. It makes it feel incredibly comfortable to walk in your garden. And at the end of the season, so here we are later November, and you can see what I've been chipping away at is with a shovel, I'm digging out the sawdust from this season and putting it up onto garden beds. And what I'm finding is that over winter, here you can see layer after layer of sawdust that was shaved out of the walkways. It's mixing with soil, and it'll have the whole winter to finalize and break down. And what it's doing is it's adding this incredibly rich mycelial network all through these garden beds and really bulking up and loosening the soil. Now in our case, a number of years ago, we inoculated our garden with wine cap mushrooms, or Stropharia rugosa annulata. And so now the sawdust has absorbed that mycelium. You can see the earthworms in there starting to work. They're a little...
They want to be asleep.
They want to be asleep. They don't want to be on camera today, so we're going to put them back. But once the sawdust has some time to soak up some summer rains, have some mycelium and some life get into it, and then mixed with soil in the fall, by the spring, this soil will be so incredibly fluffy and conditioned. You probably wouldn't even notice that there was sawdust here by the time spring rolls around. And so what we can do here is take the shovel. Well, sometimes what I'll do is take a flat file and actually sharpen it a little bit on the tip. But a normal shovel lets you scrape underneath the soil and sawdust of your walkway. You can put it up onto the bed. And so this has now become a practice where each year we rob the walkways of the mulch and some of the soil. If there are weeds that are uncovered, we can pull them out and send them to the chickens. And it's a way where each year we can go a little bit deeper in the walkways, a little bit higher in the beds, and create a deeper and deeper soil for us to grow in. And it's easy enough in the spring to replenish these walkways with fresh, dry sawdust that'll keep the weeds down, keep the moisture in, and the beds will have been bulked up with the more mature sawdust. This area of the garden, you can really see how much of a textural difference it makes. This was a few weeks ago. I went through and scrape the sawdust out, put it up onto the bed. Now in this case, I also broke open some old bales of mulch hay, and where there were weeds in the garden, we just laid down thick layers of mulch, of this hay. Could be leaf bags and sheet mulching if that's what you want to do, but basically layer upon layer, and then the sawdust and some soil robbed from the walkway built onto the bed. Now we're a particularly wet site, and so the more we can raise our beds up, the better the soil can breathe and drain out. If you're a very dry site, you may want to do this a little less, but either way, adding more and more mulch, organic matter, and depositing it into your beds seems to work incredibly well for us. Here's an example of a nursery bed we just planted out yesterday or 2 days ago. It's a mix of perennial Welsh onion or Japanese negi and little baby shipmast locust in rows. And in this case, we use some slightly aged sawdust as a deep mulch on the top, just to protect the soil from freezing and thawing during the winter. In an ideal world, we would have liked to use probably more aged sawdust, but this has been sitting since July in a pile. It's nice and moist, and there is some mushroom life running through it. So to get these little seedlings through the winter, it should serve really nicely. Another layer of benefit to share with the idea of deep deposition of mulch in your walkways and then harvesting in the fall, it's an opportunity to facilitate stool layering. I've talked about this so many times. Here's a link to a video where I talk about that in more detail. Basically a great way to propagate your woody shrubs and trees that are amenable to that. So in this area, you can see I actually went ahead and put the sawdust down incredibly deeply in here. There's the little ice crust from the cold. And this actually goes down maybe 8 inches or more. That's a lot. There I am dipping in a little bit below the line of the sawdust, so now there's soil and sawdust that are integrating. And as I take this material, we've got, in this case, some grape varieties. This is one called Niagara. This is an Antovnica apple rootstock. It's kind of a mess, it's crazy in here, but by taking my pathway and taking all of that more aged, fertile sawdust and mycelial life, bringing it up and out and mulching right onto these beds up against the stems, there's an opportunity, actually a few things happen at once. I'm helping to promote the rooting of these plants into this material. I can also selectively apply the mulch very deeply where there are weeds coming up. Here's some other plants. They're lovely plants too. It's plantain and some others. But with a deep enough mulch, I'm building my garden soil. I'm suppressing certain plant characters that we may not want, and promoting the rooting for our nursery of some plants we really want. And at the same time, creating an ever-increasing reservoir in our walkways that when we get a heavy rain, this can fill with water temporarily and wick its way into these beds. So many layers of value from this material and this sort of interaction. By no means am I suggesting that sawdust should be used to the exclusion of any other mulch or that it's superior to every other mulch. But for those of you that have either free access or ample access to sawdust, it's a pretty wonderful addition to the permaculture garden to keep weeds down, to keep moisture up, and to help over time develop an incredibly loose, rich, fungal-dominant soil. So hopefully this has been useful to you. Do you use sawdust in your garden? If so, how? And we'd love to hear from some other suggestions and ideas. Have you had issues with it? Let's keep the dialogue open, and we'll keep on keeping our soils deeply protected as time goes on. Thanks for watching.